Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Casey Baum, and welcome back. What's up, guys? I am still here. I hope you like what you're hearing, because I am happy to announce that I will be the more permanent host of the GSMC Movie Podcast moving forward. I'm super excited to be talking to you still. I love talking about movies, and this is a super fun outlet to get some of these ideas out here, and I hope to share some really great movies with you. So, because I'm going to be the current host for a little while, I wanted to have a more consistent show structure, and so I thought I would run that down with you guys today, just so everybody knows what's up, and I can explain what's going to be happening. So every episode is going to have 4 segments, and each is going to be about 15 minutes. The first 3 segments are always going to consist of one movie that I'll be sharing all of my ideas on, with as little spoilers, no spoilers as possible. And so those movies, the first movie segment is going to be a new movie, always. It's always going to be something that is either currently in theaters, brand new to streaming, couple weeks old. Hopefully it'll be something that is even coming out that week. I would love to get to see movies that recent so I can share it with you guys. But it's always going to be something new, never something from, a year ago. It'll always be something brand new. Second segment is going to be something that I watched that week, and so it'll be probably a little bit older. There is the potential it'll be new if I need to catch up on something from last year, but I do want to kind of expand my film knowledge. That's always something that I enjoy doing, and if you're coming to this podcast, I hope that you like doing that too. It's always good to watch some stuff that's a little bit older, stuff that is deemed as really great, and maybe even some bad films every now and then. That's always fun. And then the last segment is going to be a movie recommendation. So based on the first 2, kind of the themes of the episode or the genres of each movie, I'm going to recommend a movie to you guys. So since the first 2 movies are movies that came out or that I'm seeing that week, there's no guarantee that I'm going to love both of them. I try and stay optimistic. I hope that I will love both of them, but on the off chance that I don't, and neither of them are actual recommendations, the last one will always be a recommendation. So if you look to this podcast for what you can watch in a week or your next movie to watch with a friend, with a loved one, that last segment is always going to be a recommendation, always something that I can guarantee is at least a movie that is good. Even if you don't like it, at least I think will be a really fun movie to watch. That's what that recommendation is for. And then the last segment is going to be a little bit more freeform. It's still going to be 15 minutes, but it's just going to be talking about movies in general. So probably about once a week, because this podcast will now be coming out on Sunday and Wednesday, I'll be doing a top 5 list. I always like doing top 10, top 5, and since there's only 15 minutes, I thought a top 5 list would be a lot more concise and reasonable for that time frame. That'll probably happen about once a week based on the themes of the episode or what's happening in pop culture or what's happening globally, just kind of relating to things going on. And if that isn't the case, then I'll probably be doing some things about talking about the film industry at large. I always like doing some research about what's going on in film in general, and that's something that can definitely enhance your knowledge of film, and so that's definitely something that would be good to know, and hopefully I can talk about that. I could also talk about some upcoming movies, but ultimately it's just going to be a little fun little segment. I'll definitely tell you what it is at the beginning of the episode just so everybody knows. And so with that being said, Sorry for the long intro today. I promise it won't be that long in the future. But given the confines of the episode, I'm going to be reviewing today is Birds of Prey because it is still quarantine. There's still not a lot of movies coming out. I'm still trying to self-isolate as much as possible. So Birds of Prey is fairly old. It came out in March, I believe, but it is available to download and to rent. So that is something that is relatively new, and I would like to talk about it because I have not been given the chance to talk about it in the past. And then the second movie is going to be World War Z. I rewatched that recently, came out in 2013. I do love that movie, and it's an action movie just as much as Birds of Prey is an action movie, so I thought it would be a fun movie to talk about. And then finally, my recommendation, since the first movie I'm talking about today is a superhero movie, my recommendation is going to be my favorite superhero movie, just so happens to be my favorite movie of all time, which is Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse. I know I talked about it for about 2 minutes last week in that top 10 list, but I do love this movie. It's my favorite movie ever, and I thought it would be a great first genuine recommendation. So that's today's episode. Oh, and then the final segment is going to be, I'm going to talk about the MCU. I spent a lot of the early days of quarantine rewatching all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in chronological order, and I thought I would run that down, what that experience was like, what the MCU is going to look like moving forward, and then maybe give a little bit of a brief review and the best viewing order for those movies. So that's what the episode is going to look like today, and let's get started with Birds of Prey. All right, so Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn. I have to have the title up because I could not remember that for the life of me. I'm sorry. Is the newest film from DCEU, DC Extended Universe, and it follows Harley Quinn after her breakup with the Joker as she tries to reclaim her identity, and she teams up with Black Canary Huntress Renee Montoya as they attempt to protect a younger girl, Catherine Kane, as she is hunted down from a sinister mob boss throughout Gotham. So that's the premise of the movie. I have to say I was very excited going into this. Unlike last week's episode, I was not skeptical. Well, okay. I'm skeptical with any superhero movie because I'm a big fan of superhero movies. I've seen most that the genre has to offer over the past decade or so. But that being said, Harley Quinn was my favorite character and definitely the standout role in Suicide Squad, which was a pretty bad superhero movie. And so I don't think that's an unpopular opinion. I think she really was the best part of that movie. Margot Robbie is the reason for that, first of all, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So I was definitely very excited for this movie. The trailers looked really fun. It looked really lighthearted mostly, but it did have an R rating, which kind of intrigued me. So I am happy to say that it did not disappoint. I really, really loved this movie. First of all, I was wrong in the opener. It came out in February, beginning of February. So it is actually a little bit of an older movie. I'm hoping in the future to be talking about newer movies, but this is available to rent. And it didn't do great at the box office compared to a lot of other superhero movies, which is unfortunate. And so I would recommend supporting it on digital. And it's a fun movie to watch with. If you have some older kids, I would say it's fun for the family because it is R. There are some violent moments. There are definitely some crude jokes in there. Or if you're just hanging out with a friend, I would recommend this movie. It's more than fun. That's, I think, my biggest takeaway from this movie. I wrote down unbelievably fun. And I also wrote down that it's very movie-y. Like I think there's a tendency in film in general, but particularly with the superhero genre right now, to move into that dark, gritty, hyper-realistic depiction of superheroes, which isn't necessarily bad. I think that comes from The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan, and persists today for sure. You can see it moving with the MCU, definitely moved in that direction for a little bit. That still took hold in DC universe with, Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Joker even. I'll get to Joker too, because I was not necessarily a big fan of that movie. But back to Birds of Prey. Birds of Prey is just super fun, and it's a movie. It gets to be a movie. It doesn't have to be this hyper realistic thing. It's definitely hyper stylized, for one. So that's one of my favorite parts of the movie. And yeah, let's get into talking about the movie at large. I'm going to not say any spoilers, but I will talk about this movie pretty in depth because I did love it. I saw it twice in theaters. I think I saw it opening day, maybe a couple of days after, but it was good enough for me to see twice. I really, really loved it. So DC is doing this really cool thing with their movies right now. I think that they did not catch the bandwagon of the extended universe extended universe, larger universe early enough. I talked about that a little bit last week with the monster universe from Universal, how they didn't really nail that one down. And DC has tried and is still trying for sure. And I think Justice League is sort of what tipped them off as to the fact that they're not doing as good as Marvel is. Marvel really took their time to build these characters. I think DC took for granted the fact that Batman and Superman, and even Wonder Woman to a certain extent, is so just large in pop culture and just generally in the zeitgeist. I think they took that for granted. It didn't really build the characters as much as they should have. That's one of the positives that came out of Wonder Woman, because they really took the time to make Wonder Woman, because there hadn't been an on-screen version of Wonder Woman yet, which is crazy, first of all, for such a popular character existing for 75 years. But anyway, that's besides the point. So because DC is doing this with their movies, or because they're not doing it with their movies, they're not doing too good of a job. They're now making movies that technically exist in a larger universe, but aren't necessarily confined to that universe, if that makes sense. Because Marvel makes all these movies that are fun and different, but ultimately they're all kind of one note. They're all very, very similar at the very least. And DC is not doing that. They're letting their movies be fun and flamboyant or dark and gritty, just tonally very different, which is great. And so this movie is given the chance to exist outside of that larger universe, because this is a Gotham that we've never really seen before. Gotham is always depicted as dark and gritty and dirty, and this one is fun and colorful and crazy. So it's a whole different side of Gotham that is really the vision of the director and the production team. So I'm really happy that got to be own. A Gotham is commonly referred to as sort of New York City, or at least New York City emulative. So you get to see that kind of like dark, gritty, dirty side, but then there's also obviously a fun, bright side. So that's one of the things that happens in this movie. This movie is also not cynical at all. I mean, that goes with the whole not dark and gritty thing, but I thought that was super fun. There are some darker, deeper themes that kind of get hinted at, particularly with some of the gender dynamics that go on with some of the characters, but none of it is met with cynicism or pessimism. All of it is met with positivity. Ultimately, that's not across the board. You still got to have that sort of lowest low, darker moments for the characters, but overall, the movie stays pretty fun and enjoyable throughout. As far as fun and enjoyable throughout, I think I can't keep going unless I talk about Harley Quinn, the character, because I was a little bit worried that Harley Quinn wouldn't necessarily be able to hold an entire film, because she was so fun in Suicide Squad. Margot Robbie was meant for that character overall. And there were some moments in Suicide Squad that some of her quips were a little bit, I don't want to say annoying, but like a little bit annoying. And so I didn't know if she'd be able to hold an entire film, or at least not become obnoxious in that film. And she doesn't at all. And as much as there are supporting characters like Black Canary, Huntress, Renee Montoya, they do not hold most of the screen time in this movie. And so Harley Quinn is the bread and butter of the movie. The movie would not work without Harley Quinn. In fact, when it was in theaters, because of the whole fact that the box office wasn't doing too well, they changed the title to Harley Quinn: Birds of Prey for a little bit. I think it has changed back, and I like the Birds of Prey title a little bit better. But I understand why they did that, because Harley Quinn is the entire makeup of this movie. This movie would not have worked nearly as well. This movie, actually, I would argue this movie wouldn't work at all without Harley Quinn doing the job that she did. Her character is so fleshed out. You get the sad moments, the happy moments, the fact that she's just this crazy anti-hero who gets moments to be really compassionate because of the whole hero part of her name, but then gets moments to turn that on its head with the anti part of her name. So I was really happy that they stuck to that part of the character. There's definitely an evolution of Harley Quinn happening right now, which I'm super excited about, because the only part of this movie that I was really skeptical about was it had been announced prior that there would be no Joker in this film. And as much as I don't need a Joker in a Harley Quinn movie, Harley Quinn from the start is so connected to the Joker. I was a little bit worried that you wouldn't get to see all of the nuances of her character, and they do a very good job addressing that in the beginning of the movie. They have a little bit of an animated sequence at the very beginning, which I thought was super cute. The animation style was awesome and was very, very fun. And then after that, you don't need the Joker at all. They reference the Joker a little bit. I don't think they reference it too much, at least in my opinion. And so Harley Quinn works, you get to see her exist outside of the Joker, create her own identity a little bit, which has happened, I think, in the comics for a very long time. They borrow a lot from the comics, the whole hyena pet, the apartment. So I thought that was fantastic. I really loved seeing Harley Quinn do her thing in this movie. I would have liked to see a little bit more of some of the other characters, though, because the acting is pretty good. There are some moments where it's a little bit one note, particularly Huntress and a little bit of Renee Montoya. I don't think I just don't think they have as many character moments as they should. And so I can't really say that their acting was bad. I didn't think it was my favorite part of the movie, but they just didn't really were given a chance to shine at all. Their characters seem very one note. So the movie, I think, is super fun. The screenplay, the script isn't as strong as I would like. I think it probably could have gone through maybe one or two more passes, and it would have been would have been great. Would have been a lot better. But I don't think that necessarily takes away from the movie. The movie is still enjoyable. Any major gripes? It is pretty darn similar to Deadpool. Harley Quinn, first of all, is a similar character to Deadpool. She breaks the fourth wall every now and then. She's mean, but also a hero sometimes. She makes very crude jokes. She's independent, at least now, in her character. So pretty similar to Deadpool. The movie is also similar to Deadpool. It's told sort of out of order in flashbacks, kind of. And so that's the only major thing. I don't think that took away from it. That was something that was pointed out to me after the movie, so it wasn't even something that I thought of during the movie necessarily. And I actually think that this one is I kind of like this one a little bit more than Deadpool. Deadpool, I don't think, was as stylized, as interesting to visually, as fun. I do think Ryan Reynolds is great, but this review isn't about Deadpool. It's about Birds of Prey. So that's the only major thing, because, like I said, Deadpool isn't as interesting stylistically. This one really is. Tonally, it's completely all over the place. There's that animated bit in the beginning. There's a whole musical number, which actually I think was one of my favorite parts of the movie for sure. The costumes are all over the place. The ending is the right before the climax is really dark. It's almost like a trailer. It's a little silly, but I really appreciated how silly it was. The beginning is just fun. She has a love interest with a sandwich. So like it's totally crazy, off the wall, and I think that only enhances it because that's who Harley is. That's her character. So I really liked that. And the direction from Kathy Yan nailed it. I don't think that would have worked at all if we didn't have a competent director. Kathy Yan had done one other feature film that I have not seen, and so I think giving her the reins of such a large movie was really bold. It's something that a lot of superhero movies are moving towards. But Kathy Yan really nailed it. You get a really clear vision of who Harley is. There's a really different depiction of her in Suicide Squad than there is in this one. And I think that's a depiction that's missing from a lot of other superhero movies, is this level of empathy that doesn't necessarily happen with a lot of male-driven superhero movies, because obviously, given that it's female-led and the entire ensemble cast is women, the only prominent man in the movie is Black Mask, who's the villain, Ewan McGregor. There's obviously going to be some gender dynamics going in, either within the movie or externally thinking about before the movie, watching the movie. But I think all of them are addressed beautifully. And the whole notion that there can't be a female-led superhero movie is, first of all, crazy to me. But secondly, you want some sort of diversity in the stories that are being told. And like I said, there's a level of, I don't want to say toxic, but just hyper masculinity in a lot of these male-driven superhero movies that is missing from the superhero genre. And so getting that really pure femininity that isn't bogged down by a masculine character. I say that because there's a lot of female protagonists, even from the past. I think the biggest one that comes to mind is Ripley from the Alien franchise, that it might be a woman in the lead role, but it is still a masculine hero, strong, stoic, an unbreakable will almost sometimes. And again, not a bad thing, but it's almost implying that you can't be a hero, you can't be strong unless you are masculine. And so I like seeing that there is this level of compassion and empathy that can be brought to a superhero like Harley Quinn or Black Canary, because you actually do see an example of that in The Huntress, because I think she's a very masculine hero. There are definitely some points to be made for Huntress. I can't say she was my favorite character, but enough with the gender rant. I like looking at things in a gender perspective. That's just me personally, and this one definitely makes way for that pretty clearly. But I really, really liked it. I thought it was all addressed great. It all worked fantastic. Final things, the R rating, super awesome. You get some fun moments that you wouldn't see in a PG-13 movie. The score and the soundtrack are also great. I'm talking about Spiderverse later on, and the composer for Spiderverse also did this score, so you get a little bit of that techno taste. The soundtrack is super fun too. Again, another thing I'll talk about during Spiderverse, but the soundtrack is all over the place, all female artists, which I think is great. I think it was curated by Margot Robbie, if I know correctly. And a little bit of a shout out to my girl Macy Peters, who's one of my favorite artists who does not have a lot of love, but she was featured on this soundtrack with Smile. Go check that song out. That's just me personally. I like that song a lot, and I like Macy Peters a lot. So yeah, that's Birds of Prey. I really, really liked this movie. I thought it was so fun. Is it a little bit generic? Sure. Are there some moments that are a little bit silly? Sure. I think that makes the movie all that more fun, though, all that more enjoyable. Great movie to watch with some friends. So I'm going to give this one a strong 7. I think it's really great. Harley Quinn, Margot Robbie is fantastic. And yeah, that's Birds of Prey. So for the rest of the episode, next, I'm going to be talking about World War Z. And then after that, I'll be talking about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the MCU. I'll give my rundown of some of those movies, talk about the future of the MCU. So that's what you can expect for the rest of the episode. So make sure you stay tuned. And right now, we're going to take a little bit of a break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
And welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. If you're just tuning in or skipping around, I just gave my review of Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn. I can't remember. I lost the page. I'm now going to give a review of World War Z. Then I'm going to give my review of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, my favorite movie of all time. And finally, I'm going to talk about the MCU. Give a little bit of a rundown from some of those movies. So yeah, we're talking about World War Z, which is super fun. It's one of my favorite movies. I really love this movie, and I know that it's kind of, people just think it's sort of like okay, like it's fine or it's good. But I kind of think it doesn't get as much love as it should. So this movie came out in 2013. It was a summer blockbuster, and it follows Jerry Lane, played by Brad Pitt, as he undergoes a zombie apocalypse, and attempts to find a cure in a very rampant zombie apocalypse. Like these zombies are running around. They're a very different depiction of zombies than I had ever seen before. Terrifying. It's basically your generic zombie movie. He's looking for a cure. He used to be an army guy, and now he's moving around from place to place with different military personnel to figure out if he can save the entire world. Pretty grandiose. So this movie went through production hell. I don't know all of the intricacies of it, but this movie is this book is pretty popular. It's a book written by Max Brooks, and it had been bought, had been optioned for a movie mid 2000s, late 2000s, 2000, aughts. I think I really hate that word. Sorry. But it had been optioned then, and then the screenplay had been written. The studio thought that the direction of being pretty similar to the book wasn't the way to go, wanted a little bit more of a typical action movie. Then the ending had gotten changed. This movie has like 6 screenwriters. One of them is Drew Goddard, who's one of my favorite screenwriters, though. So the fact that it has that many screenwriters, it's unbelievable to me how cohesive this movie is for having that many screenwriters. Because I just think it's a fun movie. I mean, it's scary for parts of it, but it's just extremely enjoyable of an action movie. It's not similar to the book at all. So the book is written in almost a documentary format. So it's written with different interviews of people, different accounts of what had happened kind of after or during the apocalypse, the zombie outbreak. So this one is written in this one is depicted, the movie, in real time as Brad Pitt is going about the inception of the outbreak. And so it's not written in that, or it's not created in that documentary style, which I think would have been very interesting to see. But I do still really enjoy World War Z, the movie. Like I said, the story is a lot more conventional than the book is. So the book, I think, would have been an interesting adaptation, but I think going the conventional route for a summer blockbuster still makes for a very, very fun movie. Over the top. It follows all of your zombie tropes, or most of them. It follows all of the action tropes. I think the differences in story that stand out to me are the standouts of the movie. So I actually also own the script to this movie, like I had said with Ex Machina last week. And the script is, the character dynamics in the script are a lot less kind. They're not malicious in any way, but they're not nearly as fleshed out. The family dynamic is not nearly as positive of a portrayal, and so moving that in the movie to become a much more lighthearted, fun, optimistic portrayal of the family unit in the first kind of 10-15 minutes of the movie makes for some really strong character building and really some great depth that we as an audience really care about these characters now. So I really thought that was a great switch in the movie, and not necessarily not as exhausted in action movies. You don't get to see all of that intense character building as much in other superhero movies, action movies. They're almost synonymous at this point, action and superhero. Anyway, the other thing that I think really stood out to me that I think is really great is that the third act, emotionally, the stakes are very high, like a third act should be. But compared to the first 2 acts of the movie and compared to most action movies in general, the third act is very quiet. It's very slowed down, laid back. There's still the threat of zombies, the threat of a lot of zombies, but there's not an action set piece. There's not big explosions. They got enough of that going on in the first 2 acts of the movie. And that was a third act that was changed and reshot, I think, multiple times. So I'm glad that that's the one that they went with. I think it really humanizes some of these characters. It makes the world a lot more realistic. And so, and it makes the movie a lot less generic, in my opinion. I spoke about the characters a little bit earlier. And then tying that back to the screenplay, a lot of the character moments are pretty coincidental. A Jerry Lane, Brad Pitt, definitely has agency in the movie. You're not necessarily thinking that he can't make it by without these coincidences happening, but there are a lot of coincidences. There are a lot of times where he gets out of it just in the nick of time, with a lot of luck on his side and a lot of help from some other people. So there is that, but suspension of disbelief, particularly in a zombie movie and an action movie, I don't think that I just think in general, viewing movies as super, or that they should be super realistic, isn't a good thing overall. Like, I do appreciate, and I really appreciate movies that are realistic, if that's what they're going for. That is one of my favorite kinds of movies. But I think particularly among the film world and film critics, film students, there's this notion that a movie isn't very good if it's not very realistic, or it's just too silly or over the top. But I really like when a movie gets to be a movie. And so this really is a movie. I don't know if that makes as much sense as I want it to, but it's just not bogged down by trying to be realistic, trying to depict things in a natural way. It's just, we're going to be a movie and we're going to have fun and it's going to be scary. I use fun in a way that's like not necessarily like good things happening to a character. It's just enjoyable to watch, over the top. So that's how I'm using fun, at least in this context. So there are a lot of those moments. But I mentioned Brad Pitt, his character is great. Brad Pitt gives a knockout performance in this for such a kind of typical character. Like, he's just a guy. I mean, he is kind of a superhero kind of in this movie. Like, he does a lot of stuff, gets out of a lot of stuff, a lot of pain. He can like do first aid, and but he did work in the military. At least that's what's hinted at in the film. But for being just kind of an average guy, Brad Pitt gives a really humanizing and a really deep performance, I think, in a movie that didn't necessarily even deserve that. I'm glad that it had it. It makes me like the movie that much more, puts it up there with some of my favorites subjectively, but he makes this movie all that it can be. He signed on to this movie pretty early because it's produced by his production studio, which he is making a lot of really great choices. I'm a big Brad Pitt fan. I think he's a really phenomenal actor. So he gives a fantastic performance in this movie. The direction for the film leans into a lot of the action tropes, the action stereotypes. I think it could have been a little bit more interesting, but like I said, it isn't bogged down by trying to be something that it's not. It's a action blockbuster for the summer of 2013, and it nails it. It's directed by Mark Forster, who prior to this had been known for Quantum of Solace, James Bond. So he definitely is an action director, had been an action director. So he leans into a lot of those tropes, because as much as it's a zombie movie, it isn't really a horror movie at all. There's like one or two jump scares, but even that can happen in an action movie. It's really just an action movie, which I appreciate. I think there are a lot of different genre routes that you can go with such a what's the word? There's so many zombie movies happening. Oh, an oversaturation of zombie films. There are some different routes that you can go, and I'm glad they went with this route. There are still some creepy horror moments, which I like. The zombies are great. You see a lot of the same depiction of zombies, because that's what you get when you have an archetype of a creature. So you get the slow, monotonous, lethargic zombie, and in this one you get a fast one, which is terrifying in and of itself, but you get a really clear moment to see the zombie towards the end of the film. And this really stood out to me when I watched it, because I watched this in theaters, I think twice also, when I was 13. You get the zombie like chatters its teeth, which really stood out to me. It's a very simple choice, but it really draws attention to the mouth, which is so important for zombies, and it is really creepy. That moment, I think, is a big standout of what that what horror elements can be added to an action movie that enhance the film. The score, a little bit generic. There's a lot of the action sort of bass baritone, like Inception, like wah kind of thing going on. So score isn't all that much, but when I started this movie again, because I rewatched it a couple weeks ago, and there's a Muse song that is used in the beginning and it kind of becomes the theme of the movie. And oh my God, is it good? It is so good. I only associate it with this movie, and I'm glad that it is associated with this movie. I'm glad they made it kind of the theme of it. It's used in the intro to the big exposition dump, which I'll talk about in just a sec. But the song, I wish I could play right now. It literally gives me chills. It is so good. It's like this techno kind of back and forth. But I really love it. It really adds to the movie. The intro I like a lot. It is definitely an exposition dump. Like there's no getting around it. It really is just sort of like, here's what's going on. Here's what has happened. We're not gonna leave anything up to the imagination, which isn't always my favorite thing in a movie. Probably could have been done a little bit smoother, but I do like the introduction, and there's a lot of juxtaposition between the natural world and like viruses, and like there's ants and insects kind of chewing things, like decaying things. So there's definitely some interesting visual associations going on in the introduction, which I do really appreciate. I said virus. It's a harder movie to watch right now with the added context of what's going on. The geopolitical commentary that's made in the movie is also very interesting, with a lot of countries kind of some countries talking to each other, some countries fending for themselves, which is kind of happening right now. So it definitely is interesting to watch with the added context of what is going on currently. The virus going on right now isn't necessarily as frightening. I don't want to say scary, because the virus going on right now is scary, but it's not as startling as zombies, but it is obviously just as severe. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to watch, a little bit harder. But I also think that it kind of enhances the viewing experience, because you get to kind of place it a little bit in context of the real world, which I think adds to a level of realism that may be lacking in the movie at large. So like I said, it's simple, but it is really tight. It's really cohesive. The movement of the characters and the set pieces, I think, is a really great part of the movie. Brad Pitt moves all around. He goes to America, Israel. The end is like Ireland or Scotland. I can't quite remember. But so he moves around location-wise, but I think the movie would have been slower and just slowed down if there wasn't all this movement. The zombies move really fast, and I think it's cool that the filmmaking also moves really fast in general. So I thought that was a really great part of the movie. Really enhances everything. So yeah, it's tight, it's cohesive, it's fun, it's enjoyable. Kind of like Birds of Prey is a little bit generic. Sure, I still really enjoy it. I don't think that necessarily takes away from it. Also, little fun fact that I like a lot is Peter Capaldi is in the end of the film. He plays a doctor at the WHO, aka, so he's a Who doctor, and then he also plays Doctor Who, which is really dumb. I'm sorry, but I really like it. I think it's a really fun fact. He's a Who doctor, and he's Doctor Who. Anyway, okay. He's the first actor to have ever done that. Anyway, that was dumb. Okay, so I'll give this movie, actually, I'll probably give, subjectively, a light 8 out of 10. Maybe even a solid 8 out of 10. More objectively, it's probably closer to Birds of Prey, like a solid 7 out of 10. So I'll keep it at the light 8 out of 10 for me. I do really like this movie. So I think it's super fun. And if you have the time, want to watch a lighter horror type movie, an action blockbuster at home, check it out. I watched it on Amazon. It's available to rent. So I do like this movie a lot. That's World War Z. And next, we're going to talk about Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, which I'm so excited to talk about. So I can't wait for that. So we're going to talk about Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, and then I'm going to be talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the final segment. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around, I have given my review on Birds of Prey, as well as a brief review on World War Z. I will now be giving a review of Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, and then I will be talking about the MCU at large, best way to watch, some reviews on those films, and possibly about the future of the franchise. So, right now is my weekly recommendation, which there's no better recommendation for me than my favorite movie of all time. We talked about Birds of Prey. We'll be talking about the MCU. It's a superhero-filled day. My favorite movie just so happens to be a superhero film, and it's Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse. It's pretty bold for this to be my favorite, given that it was only released about a year and a half ago. But some background, Spider-Man is my favorite character, pop culture-wise, without a doubt. I think he's very important to pop culture and to culture, society in general. And this is such a fantastic depiction of multiple versions of the character, a brand new imagining of some versions of that character. And it got me so excited. I saw this movie. If you thought that seeing a movie twice in theaters, which is what I did for Birds of Prey and World War Z, movies that I thought were pretty good, this one I saw 4 times in theaters. I saw it opening night with one of my friends, and I remember the title sequence came on. If you've seen the movie, okay, actually, hold on. Before I'm going to get into this, and I'm really going to get into this movie. So if you haven't seen it, I'll give a synopsis of it. So it basically follows Miles Morales, who is a teen living in Brooklyn who gets bit by a spider, much like Peter Parker, and starts to become another version of Spider-Man. But after witnessing the death of the current Spider-Man in that universe, a new Spider-Man comes about from a collider, parallel universe creator, and it is Miles Morales learning how to become Spider-Man with the help of other spider people as they try to get back to their home world. So that is the premise of the film. If you haven't seen it, recommend seeing it as soon as possible. It is free on Netflix right now, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to recommend it as well, because it's a free movie that you can watch at home if you have Netflix. So like I said, I saw this opening night. I saw it with one of my friends, and the opening title sequence, it exemplifies, first of all, just how inventive this film is right off the bat. All of the opening title cards with the different producing logos start to glitch out, which is kind of the a motif that goes on throughout the movie and is necessary to understanding the world and the characters. And there's this crazy hyper techno music by the guy who did the score for Birds of Prey, Daniel Pemberton, I believe his name is. And we leaned over to each other and we were like, is this the greatest movie of all time? And it was. Like I said, I don't think that there's such thing as a perfect film, but if there was, it would be this. Subjectively, I can't necessarily come at everything from an objective point of view. Obviously, I try and be as objective and holistic as possible. Some things are just subjective, so that's why it's my favorite. But I do think that looking back in 20 years as an achievement to the superhero genre, an achievement of animation, this will be hailed as one of those films that stand the test of time and become one of the greatest in general. So I genuinely believe that. And this may be a little bit rambly because I said last week that I could say everything about this movie is good, and it is, and I will try and get all of that in. But yeah, let's just start with the fact that I had extremely high expectations. Like I said, Spider-Man's one of my favorite characters. I also am in love with animation in general. This trailer that first got released was released a year before the movie came out. It was actually released on the day of the Army-Navy football game. If anybody's a football fan, that's just a thing that I remember. But I was watching with my friends, and the trailer is absolutely breathtaking. The shots are beautiful. The music was super, super cool. It's nothing like I had ever seen before. And so my expectations were through the roof for this movie. And I came out of it thinking that it was better than my expectations, which is absolutely crazy. So let's just run down some of the best things about the movie. So the animation, a lot of people think that animation is for younger people. I definitely went through that phase when I was probably, you hit about like 10 or 12 and you start to reject a lot of things from when you were younger. And so that was the case for me, for sure, that you associate with childhood. So like animation, for example, that's almost all that I watched when I was little, because that's kind of what is made for children most of the time. And so anything that was animated, I kind of rejected for a while. And glad that I got back into this, because animation is not inherently for kids. It's really just a newer way to tell a story, a much more recent. It's not even recent, honestly. There are examples of animation from the 30s, the 20s, with things like stop motion and flip books and stuff like that. So it has only enhanced the genre. It has only elevated the genre to a point that you couldn't tell certain stories if it wasn't for animation, which I really, really love, because you get a whole new slew of the stories that you can tell. And Spider-Man is one of them, because Spider-Man obviously has been told many, many times in live action, but really getting the intricacies of his swinging around and comic books and the color and the themes of all of these things that is told so well in the visual medium of art and comic books, being translated to a more fluid version of that on screen really works for animation. And the filmmakers utilize all of that in this film. So one of those examples is that most animated films are created at 24 frames per second, and those are called ones. So one still is used for one frame. So everything has a fluid motion. In Spider-Man, they used twos a lot of the time, which is the same case. So it would be 12 frames per second, but one frame would be held for one shot would be held for 2 frames, basically. So it makes the animation a lot less fluid. But what would happen is that they would film some characters on twos and some characters on ones. So Miles, who's the main character of the film, is learning how to become Spider-Man throughout the movie. So he's obviously going to be a lot clunkier, not nearly as fluid as Peter Parker, who is in the film as well, teaching him. So Peter Parker is being used on ones. So he is a fluid motion, knows how to swing, knows how to do his thing. Miles is not. And so it really shows visually how these characters are different, how they're moving through the world differently. And it really isn't something that people may not even notice. They might notice that Miles is a lot choppier, but won't notice that that's the filmmaking technique that really brings the characterization to the forefront, which is absolutely crazy. There's also uses of 3D techniques to make things look blurry when they're out of focus. That is a lot different than other movies. A lot of the animation looks as though it was done with like ballpoint pen, almost with different dots. I forget what the art style of that is called, but that's blending together to create a frame and to create a different color when it's actually two other colors. So there are some I don't know all the intricacies of animation. I wish I did, but that is just some of the insane filmmaking techniques that are used in this movie to ultimately enhance it. Like I said, the characters are so lovable. Spider-Man in movies in particular, but a lot of superhero movies get criticism for showing too many heroes and too many villains in one movie, and it can get really, really complicated, and no character really gets the amount of screen time. This film has 6 main superheroes and three main villains, but then like 2 other villains kind of. So it's like 12 characters that you definitely have to keep track of, but they're all done so beautifully because they really take the time to focus on Miles and Peter, and particularly their relationship, and mainly Miles, which is great because another main criticism of Spider-Man is the fact that we have a little bit of a Spider-Man exhaustion because of the fact that we've seen Peter Parker and his origin story so many times. So getting a new version of the character in Miles Morales is really great. Another great example of that is that Miles gets a lot of criticism in the comics as kind of just being another version of Peter Parker. He doesn't really have any characteristics that make him any different than Peter, or he's kind of filling the same vacant hole if you don't have Peter Parker in comics. There's really time taken in this film to make Miles a fully fleshed out different character than Peter Parker, which is necessary because he's side by side with Peter for a lot of it. And so making those changes to Miles' character in the film makes him a lot more of a fleshed out, lovable character that people can really relate to and will sustain Miles as a relevant character for such a long time after this film, which I think is really, really important and is really, really great. All of the characters are so well fleshed out. The character relationships are so well fleshed out. And that's also a point to be made for the acting. The voice acting for people who are not traditionally voice actors is really, really wonderful. Gwen Stacy kind of has a deeper voice that Haley Steinfeld doesn't necessarily use as often. That makes her a lot more down to earth. Jake Johnson is such a fun, like light comedic tone for Peter Parker that still has that feeling of that weight of maturity and adulthood onto him. Shameik Moore knocks it out of the park. Absolutely. He's playing like a 14, 15-year-old, and I believe he's like 2021, and he really creates the sound of a young kid in his voice that is not shown in a lot of other movies that he's in. So I think that the voice acting is absolutely stunning. The themes for the film that is exemplified in these characters is something that is really made for everybody. I think a lot of animation gets a bad rap because of the fact that it's aimed towards kids, and a lot of those themes are necessary for kids and obviously necessary for adults, but things that adults have already know or have already learned. And Spider-Man really makes a point in saying that it really is a feeling of acceptance and community and friendship, and there's levels of inadequacy of certain characters that I think adults might fall into. I think I mentioned a lot of this last episode, but adults might feel like they're out of place just as much as a kid would in maybe a new city or a new job, a new environment in general. And so saying that like you can embrace who you are, and that will create your community and create that acceptance, as opposed to maybe assimilating into something that's already been established. There's a line in the trailer that isn't actually used in the movie where Peter Parker says to Miles, "Don't do it like me, do it like you." And so you really get to see these characters become who they are and be who they are, and that's what makes them so lovable and stand out, and that's what creates the friendship. It's not them trying to be somebody that they're not, which is really important for kids, but it's a really important reminder for adults. I've shown this movie to so many people that have been skeptical because it's animation and it's superhero, and it might not be something that somebody is into, but it really is a film for every age group, for anybody. It is so fun. There's a lot of adult humor, quote unquote, that is not necessarily like sexually oriented or kind of like crude, which there's a time and place for that. I don't really like the notion that there should be adult humor in kids content that's like, oh, we snuck in a little bit of a sex joke in there. Like, I think that's a little bit, I don't know. It's a little icky to me. And I really like when there's adult humor that kids might not necessarily understand because it's just a little bit more mature and it might go over their head, whether it's a visual gag or an actual joke that adults can really latch onto. That is also super fun. And so that happens a lot. There are a lot of mature themes that go on that kids might not necessarily get, but it's really fun to have in the movie. I don't have too much time, more time to talk about this movie. I could go on literally for hours. So another thing that I'll say that is a huge standout is the world that's created with music and the soundtrack, the score and the soundtrack. The score is absolutely breathtaking with the techno themes, the hip hop themes, the different 808s that are used and the different kind of synths that are used create a different sound tonally to a lot of other superhero movies and Spider-Man movies. And then that kind of complements the animation. The other thing that's really, really cool is the soundtrack for the film. Almost all of the songs in the soundtrack are used in the film. So I listened to the soundtrack before the movie, and it kind of created a world that I'm diving into. It created this sense of this is a different world, and now I'm going to learn about it, and then I'm going to see how it's implemented into the film. And a very cool example of that is the song Sunflower, which Post Malone and Sway Lee made for the film, was released, I believe, a couple weeks, if not months before the film. And it became very popular. It became a huge radio hit. So I was a little skeptical at how important it is for the film. And I was like, okay, this might feel a little bit weird, but it almost created this sense that this is a song that has existed before you watched the movie, that it's like this is a song in the world of the film, not for the film, which was very, very cool. Another quick example of how intricately focused the filmmakers were on this movie that I thought was a mistake the first time I watched it. There's a song on the soundtrack by Lil Wayne, and Lil Wayne has a popular producer tag that he uses in a lot of his songs where it's a lighter flick, where it's to let you know that it's his song kind of thing. And that's obviously in the song on the soundtrack, and it's also in the song in the movie, but the movie is using the song undiegetically, which is a term that basically means it is not heard by the characters in the movie, it's heard by the audience. And so the lighter flick doesn't really make any sense. And so I was like, okay, was that a mistake to leave in? And then watching it again, the lighter flick is actually used as a sound for somebody moving their hands. So it's actually a sound for something happening in the movie that just ended up being a sound cue, but it also is the lighter flick in the soundtrack. It's crazy. It's so cool. That's just me kind of geeking out for a second. But basically, this movie is for everybody. It is so enjoyable. Literally watch it this instant, even if you're skeptical of it. It's the third act is so crazy and colorful. There are so many fun visual gags that happen based on the fact that it's animation and comic books and things like that. It's hilarious. I cannot stress how crazy good this movie is. So an absolute 10 out of 10, a solid, strong 10 out of 10. This movie is fantastic. My favorite movie ever. So that's me geeking out about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I do really hope that you watch it. And yeah, so that's the movie. Next up, we're going to be talking about the MCU, another franchise that I also really like. And we're going to take a quick break right before that.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around, I have given my review on Birds of Prey, as well as a review on World War Z and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And this segment is going to be super fun. It's basically a freeform segment to talk about some fun things in the movie world. This segment today because I've reviewed Birds of Prey and Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, and then World War Z is an action movie, I figured that I would talk about the MCU because I think that's a super fun thing to talk about. It's one of my favorite franchises. I have commonly said that if I were to teach a course on film, it would be the MCU. I think it has done a ton for the film industry, changing it, making it better, making it maybe worse in some regards. It's a nuanced topic for sure, but I'm a huge fan of it. I really love it. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it today is because given that we're still possibly in quarantine, COVID-19 is still going on, unfortunately. So early on in the whole quarantine process, I decided to make one of my endeavors watching all of the MCU films in chronological order because I had never watched them in order. I'd also never watched them that closely back to back. I'd seen all of them. I was a huge fan, but I had never watched them all together. I basically watched them in release order. There were a couple that I had seen. I think the first one that I really watched in theaters was The Avengers, and then I kind of went back and stuff. So ever since then, definitely ever since Age of Ultron, I had been watching them in theaters in order. So I thought it'd be fun to watch it in chronological order because that's an order that people say often is a fun order to watch it. So basically, I'm going to run down what the chronological order is in case you are curious to do the same thing. It's definitely a fun thing to do if you know that you're going to be inside for a long period of time. It's definitely a fun little task if you're a fan of these movies or even if you've never seen them before. So I'm going to run down the order to watch them in chronological order as well as my current thoughts on those movies because I've gone back to watch them. In watching them a second time, I definitely have some different thoughts maybe than I had initially on release, how I feel about that order. And then that might be a little bit of a tall task because there are 22, 23 movies here. So if I still have time, then I'll give a little bit of the future of the MCU, but I might just save that for a later episode. But right now we're going to talk about the chronological order. First, my initial thoughts on that order is the fact that it's a little bit weird. I would actually recommend watching them in release order because clearly there's a reason for them to be released in that order. Maybe some modifications as to what I think the best order to watch it would be, but watching them in a chronological order, there are some movies that were released significantly later than they are in the actual chronological timeline. And as far as Marvel goes, if you've been watching them in theaters, the filmmaking has drastically changed for the better, I believe, in certain aspects. But there are movies that feel a little bit out of place when you watch them early on because it's just such a different tone for the movie, and not even in genre or in comedy maybe or action, just in the filmmaking styles is so different. So I would almost recommend watching it in release order. And there are some nuggets of knowledge that are better to be revealed later on, even though they may happen earlier. So that's just my own 2 cents on the topic. I think release order might be a little bit better to watch them in, but regardless, you can easily look up what the release order is. So let's talk about what the chronological order is and my initial thoughts on it. The first movie in the series is Captain America: The First Avenger, which I loved watching it again. I remember not liking it that much, particularly compared to The Winter Soldier, but the character building in this movie for some of the side characters is really, really great. I've been a very big fan of Peggy Carter for a while. She had a show on ABC, Agent Carter. I think Haley Atwell is awesome. I don't think that character got nearly enough love as she should. And her character building in the film is really wonderful. We really get to see Steve Rogers. He's so synonymous with just a strong buff man. And so seeing him with his morals before that is really, really cool to see. I thought initially I remember thinking that it was kind of bland. But I've kind of thrown that out the window. I think it's a very fun action movie. It's great for character building. It has some really cool character moments and a really great final scene. So I'm probably gonna have to cut down these reviews going forward. But next up in chronological order would be Captain Marvel. It takes place in the 1990s. I really wanted to love this movie. I don't love this movie as much as I would like to. I'm a huge fan of Brie Larson. I think the character of Captain Marvel is super great in the comics. As far as a female-led superhero movie, DC did it first with Wonder Woman and did it significantly better than Captain Marvel. I think the main problem with Captain Marvel is that the writing doesn't feel like it has nearly enough heart to it. There's a lot of tropes from Marvel movies in that era, so like 2016, basically post Guardians of the Galaxy movies, that are put into this movie without any of the actual depth that is used in a lot of the previous movies. So the soundtrack for the 90s is fun, but it seems kind of like a hollow female empowerment soundtrack, which I didn't necessarily like as much. I also think the character of Captain Marvel is not nearly as fleshed out or interesting as a lot of the early characters in the franchise. She kind of just seems like a rehashing of Tony Stark, kind of with that whole snarky edge, and then any of her emotional moments don't actually seem earned based on the character that she's presented to us. So that's not a fault of Brie Larson. I really, really love Brie Larson. I just think that the writing for her character was not nearly as strong as I would have liked in a franchise that has such strong characters. So I really wish Captain Marvel was better. I love the Skrulls. They're one of my favorite villains from the comics. So I do hope that Captain Marvel can get better in the sequel, because I think that there's a lot there and there's a lot of interesting things that can happen with her character. So I would love for the sequel to be great. And I believe the sequel is directed by a woman, because the first one was directed by a man and a woman, which I always thought was like a little bit like, okay, you couldn't really, you had to keep a man on. Anyway, that's just my own 2 cents. This entire thing is my own 2 cents. So if you disagree with me, that's completely valid. Anyway, Iron Man obviously started the whole thing. I love Iron Man. I think it's a fantastic movie. It's super cohesive, super concise. In rewatching it, I almost like Captain America better. I'm just partial to Captain America, the character, but Iron Man, you kind of can't. It's just such a solid movie. It's so great. I might subjectively like Captain America a little bit better, but Iron Man is really fantastic. Then Iron Man 2 comes along. The beginning of Iron Man 2 is really great. It's almost better, in my opinion, than some of the moments in Iron Man. It's really funny. It's really cool. I love seeing Tony Stark kind of just do his thing. And then it really starts to get slow. It gets really boring. So it's just very slow. Let's speed it up a little bit. Thor, pretty good. I think it's better than I remembered it. It's pretty plain. There's not too much going on. I really like Natalie Portman. Chris Hemsworth is kind of silly in this one, which I did appreciate. But I do like the character moments with Thor and Loki. So I thought it was pretty good. Not my favorite. But overall pretty in the middle. Incredible Hulk, it's bad. It's not good, but in rewatching it, it's so fun. It's just so different than the other MCU movies that I kind of had to appreciate it for what it is. It's goofy, silly, pretty bad, but it's definitely a fun movie to watch it. So I did actually kind of like it. If you go into it thinking that. The Avengers is my favorite movie in the entire franchise. I think it's so well told. It's so well put together. The characters are fun. It's also kind of subjective. I saw this when I was like 12 in the theaters on opening day. So it was like the perfect time to be seeing this as a little 12-year-old boy with everybody dressing up and screaming. So I kind of can't remove that feeling from the film. So take it with a grain of salt. But I do think that the way they built the characters beforehand and then bringing them together almost like a sitcom was just so fun. The action is really, really great, especially it's kind of taken for granted how good the action is now and how big it is. So getting a third act that is all character moments in an action-packed New York City is really, really cool for that time. And then I think does hold up really well. So the Avengers is my favorite one in the franchise. Then we move on to Iron Man 3, which was the first notion of a director getting more say or more of a vision than maybe had been given to them in the past, because Shane Black is such a creative voice in the industry. So seeing a lot of his cool moments, there's a fun diversion of who the villain is that if you're a fan of the comics, you might not have liked. I thought it was actually very fun. I did really like that twist. I thought it was enjoyable. Not nearly as interesting as Shane Black, I think, could have made it. There is a lot of studio interference that didn't necessarily happen in the future. So I wish that he would have been given a bigger chance for that, but there are still some fun moments, better than Iron Man 2, but not quite as good as Iron Man. Thor: The Dark World, very boring. I fell asleep. So I don't need to talk about this one much. It's just super boring. It doesn't really have a bearing it actually has a huge bearing on the overall plot, with the Infinity Stones, which is kind of disappointing at how bad the movie was, but Yeah, it's pretty slow. Just look up a synopsis. Don't even watch this one, in my opinion. Then we move on to Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which I didn't like as much the second time, but it's still the one of the best. I think it's probably top three, top four for sure. I really like seeing Captain America adapt to what's going on now. I think the Falcon is a super cool character. I really like seeing him in modern day. I also like seeing him criticize the government that created him. I really think there are some interesting political things that go on here, but also just some interesting moral quandaries that are addressed in this film that I think is super fun. And you really get to see Captain America be a badass. Like, it's very cool. So I do love this. Sorry, I do love this movie. This one is one of my favorites. Then we move on to Guardians of the Galaxy, which is almost better. Guardians of the Galaxy is so cool. Like I said, I wish Shane Black had been given more freedom, and James Gunn seems to have been given a lot of freedom. He really gets to tell his story. I think Guardians of the Galaxy is the strongest set of movies in the entire MCU, and rewatching them, Guardians of the Galaxy is very strong. The characters are fantastic. This is when you kind of knew that they could print money, because not even comic book fans had heard of Guardians of the Galaxy. So yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy is great. And then you get to Volume 2, which is, in my opinion, even better. The cinematography is better. The characters are, now that they're established, they actually have time to grow and change and have some fun moments. The villain is infinitely better. The themes just are created tenfold from the first one. There are just some really awesome stakes in this movie and some really creative choices that were done. So actually, if you didn't like it because of how potentially weird it was the first time you watched it, which was definitely me, I would go back and rewatch it because it's very fun. Then you get to Age of Ultron, which is the worst one. It is so bad. It's not necessarily like a terrible, terrible movie, but as far as all of the characters are so much different and like meaner than they used to be. There are some cool things that happen in the movie. I do like the farm thing, but it just makes Tony seem like an idiot. The villain is boring. The introduction of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver is also pretty boring, although I do like Scarlet Witch in the future. I just think that overall it's not all that good. If you're a fan of the movies, Age of Ultron really is kind of the worst one. Then we get to Ant-Man, which, like I said with Iron Man 3 and Shane Black having a creative voice, Edgar Wright was originally supposed to direct, and he did write it. And so he has a insanely creative voice. I'm a huge fan of him. He directed Scott Pilgrim, and I wish he had still been attached because a lot of it feels like it is a poor man's Edgar Wright, because it is directed by somebody else. So it's okay. It's pretty generic, but it is still fun. I think the character of Ant-Man is great, and I do love Paul Rudd. Then we get to Civil War, which is really enjoyable. I do love that airport scene. Just being a fan. As far as the movie goes, it's a little bit complicated, a lot going on. But overall, I do think it is enjoyable, and it makes for a pretty good conclusion for Captain America's arc in that trilogy. Then we get to Black Panther, which I liked a lot better on a rewatch, focusing less on the characters and more on sort of the world. I think Wakanda is super cool, a very cool creation. I mean, from the comics, but translated very well to screen. The only thing that's disappointing about this is that Black Panther, the character, Chadwick Boseman, I think is a lot better, a lot more interesting in Civil War. I think he's a little bit plain, a little boring in this one, but it's kind of made up for it in a lot of the other side characters that I really like. And then that final act, a little bit poor. Wish that some other routes had been taken, but I mean, Killmonger, Michael B. Jordan, is absolutely amazing in this movie. So I think it is a very, very good movie. Spider-Man Homecoming, again, on the rewatch, I think it's better than Far From Home. I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on. It's fun to see a different version of the character. As much as like I love Spider-Man, I do like seeing him kind of be Tony Stark's or taken under Tony Stark's wing. And so I like it. And I think it's him trying to prove himself. And I like a lot of what's going on here. Ant-Man and the Wasp, very bad. I'm not a big fan of this one. I liked Evangeline Lilly in the first one. I don't think she does nearly as well. And the character of the Wasp is not very interesting in this movie. And then same with Ant-Man. Just the whole plot is pretty bad. The third act is pretty fun, but it's all exposition and it's all super complicated, and it's just not. It's the only movie that I left the theater kind of being like, okay, that wasn't that good. That was not very. So, not a big fan of Ant-Man and the Wasp, honestly. Doctor Strange, again, not a very big fan of the character of Doctor Strange. The movie is cool. I like some of the time stuff, but overall, it's a pretty generic origin story. Not a huge fan of Benedict Cumberbatch or the character of Doctor Strange, but that's personal preference. So the villain is also kind of boring. Not a huge fan of Doctor Strange, but it's also not terrible. I put it kind of in the same realm as Thor. And then speaking of Thor, Thor Ragnarok is very fun. Another creative vision with Taika Waititi, who is one of my favorite directors working right now, taking the character of Thor and the world of Thor in a completely different direction, which is awesome. I don't think it's as good as everyone says it, or it's not one of my favorites necessarily. I don't think it's as good as everyone says it is, because a lot of people love this movie, but I do think it is really enjoyable. The set design, the production design is crazy. So, and it's very fun. So I like this one a lot. Then we get to Infinity War and Endgame. Initially, I thought Infinity War was better than Endgame, but rewatching it, I think Endgame is better than Infinity War. Endgame is such a satisfying conclusion, but Infinity War, watching it as a spectacle and a culmination of all of these movies, you can't really watch it as a movie. It's not really a movie. It's just much more of an event. And taking that lens, it's so great. It's so cool. It's so grand, and they make everything work. They give the characters that need their time to shine and need those that time to build up for later on. They give them that, and they focus on them, and then a lot of the other characters are sidelined or just given those cool moments in action or action set pieces. So I think that there is huge merit to this movie as like just a cultural event. And then Endgame focuses on being more of a movie. It has a very distinct 3-act structure. I think the middle is super fun. It focuses on, it really gives time for the fans of this series and lets you kind of indulge in the world of the MCU, but it doesn't necessarily do it in a way that's bashing it over your head. It's like, no, this is the world that we've created, and we're going to go back and we're going to show you, and we're going to have fun. And then the final act is crazy, is so fun. The emotional stakes are better than they've ever been. And it's just so satisfying. It feels like a series finale. It's really great. I love it. And then you get to Far From Home, which is a really nice epilogue. I do like that it's part of the Infinity Saga, because you get to see the impact of Tony Stark on the world and on Spider-Man in particular. And Spider-Man seems to be a good jumping off point for the future of the MCU. So I'm glad that it's a little bit of an epilogue for the series. So that was a lot. I'm sorry if that was a little bit too much, or if you've never seen these movies, but I do recommend a lot of them. I think it's a super fun world to be involved in. And if you're not doing anything in quarantine, you want to rewatch them or just play catch up, it's a really fun time to be doing that. And so, yeah, I love the MCU. I think it's done a lot of stuff. If you're interested in hearing more about the MCU and want me to talk about in the future in one of these other segments, leave a comment, let me know. I would like to be looking at all of your comments. I'd like to know your feedback on the show, some ideas for a final segment, or just some feedback in general. I love hearing from you guys, and I'm very, very excited to be hosting this. I love being here. I love talking about movies. So I hope all of you are doing well, and I hope you like the show. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.